Good morning to you out there in podcast world. This is Tony Denton coming to you once again from the Phoenix, Arizona area on this July the 30th, 2019 at about 10:45 in the morning. It's a nice day as usual here, even though it's a little hot. And I am ready to share with you installment number 28 of my audiobook on my book, Hebrews, From Flawed to Flawless Fulfilled. It's essentially a commentary through the book of Hebrews in 37 studies. And so today we're on number 28, which begins on page 219 of the book if you have it, and we'll be looking at Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 19. In a previous section, Paul began displaying faith's hall of fame, wherein, per chapter 12, 1 through 2, he portrayed his Jewish Christian readers as runners in a race within the confines of a coliseum. And within the stadium seats were all the faithful who had run the race before them, cheering them on to victory. Here's the picture. Each generation of the faithful, at least from Abel, chapter 11, verse 4, to the fulfillment of the promise, chapter 11, verse 39 through 40, was in a relay race for the prize of reconciliation to God. In this scenario, the baton was now in the hand of this first century and last generation of Jewish brethren, and they were on the verge of reaching the finish line. They were winning for all those who had gone before them, and more, those of us who have succeeded them. When we view it in this manner, we can see how tremendously important it was that these brethren were pressing on. It wasn't just for their salvation as individuals that they were running, but it was also for each and every child of God before them and after them. Having begun this discussion with Abel, Enoch, and Noah in our last study, verses 4 through 7, the study continues now with Abraham at verse 8. Paul wrote, "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would afterward receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going." In Abraham's case, the language is slightly stronger in that the phrase obeyed when he was called actually means while he was being called, by faith he obeyed. In other words, he was pictured here as packing while God was speaking. Check out Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 4. The phrase, the place which he would afterward receive as an inheritance, is important here because it kept the readers' minds focused on the idea of the promise brought up in chapter 10 verse 36 and how that God has always kept his promises and blessed or rewarded those who persevere. Chapter 11 verses 1 and 6 of Hebrews. The clause, not knowing where he was going, is the most important part of this verse. Abraham had no idea where he was headed or why God was putting him through this, verse 9, especially at his ripe age of 75. He just had faith in God and his promises, and he submitted. Similarly, these brethren, who claimed and greatly honored Abraham as their father, needed to imitate him. They may not have understood exactly where they were headed at this point or why God was allowing them to be put through the ringer, but they needed to have faith in God and his promises, remaining faithful to the end during all the persecutions and problems they were having during this last generation of the Israelite people. Verses 9 and 10. By faith he, that is Abraham, sojourned or lived in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Although Abraham had arrived and was in the land of promise, his family lived there simply as strangers and pilgrims, verse 13, dwelling in tents. But why? There were two reasons. Physically speaking, the promise wouldn't be completely fulfilled to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Acts 7:5, but to their descendants, Genesis 22:7. In other words, they had to wait until the sins of the Amorites had reached their limit, Genesis 15:13 through 16, before God would take the land from them and give it to Abraham's descendants. Check out Joshua 21:43 through 45. And, spiritually speaking, it's pretty obvious that one reason God had them enter the land prematurely was to provide another example and to create another shadow to encourage those of Paul's day. In other words, Abraham exemplified the faith they needed. and his life of inconvenience pictured the inconveniences that they in this first century were having to endure while they also waited upon God throughout all their persecutions and problems. The phrase, "the city whose builder or architect and maker or builder is God," is an unmistakable reference to that about which Paul had been writing all along, namely, the coming of the kingdom with all its attendant blessings. In chapter 9, verse 11, and chapter 10, verse 1, Paul spoke of all this as the good things about to come. In chapter 6, verse 5, he wrote of the age about to come. Similarly, in chapter 2, verse 5, he wrote of the world about to come. While in chapter 13, verse 14, he wrote of the city about to come. And in chapter 12, verse 28, he simply called it a kingdom. So the good things to come, the age to come, the world to come, the city to come, all those passages using the Greek word melo, which means about to, and in chapter 12, it's a kingdom. Here are some additional designations for the same. In chapter 11, verse 14, he called it a homeland. In chapter 11, verse 16, he called it a heavenly country. In chapter 12, verse 22, he called it the city of the living God. In chapter 12, verse 22, he also called it the heavenly Jerusalem. In chapter 12, verse 23, he called it the General Assembly. And in chapter 12, verse 23, he also called it the Church of the Firstborn. Here are a couple corresponding more to chapter 11, verse 10. In chapter 8, verse 2, he called it the true tabernacle which the Lord erected and not man. And in chapter 9, verse 11, he called it the perfect tabernacle not made with hands. So that's what the book of Hebrews is about. The fulfillment of the kingdom that began with the first Adam and was culminated and found its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus, the second Adam, when he returned in the kingdom. Matthew 16:28. So though there's no clear record of it, Abraham was obviously made aware of this coming kingdom, a kingdom on the verge of being completed at the time Hebrews was written. Check out the Greek word melo in the first 4 references. And when the fullness of the kingdom arrived, then the spiritual side of the promises to Abraham were finally and totally fulfilled. Check out Galatians 3, 7 through 9, and verses 13 through 14. Alright, verse 11. Hebrews 11, verse 11. By faith Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past age, because she judged him, that is God, as being faithful, because he had promised. Or because she judged him, God, faithful, who had promised. Now, although it doesn't sound like it at first reading, I believe the faith of this verse still has reference to the faith of Abraham, not Sarah. There are at least 6 reasons for this. Number 1, the word also isn't found in any other case in this chapter, indicating that Paul was enlarging upon the subject of Abraham's faith, not Sarah's. Besides, also, which may be translated as even, is actually between faith and Sarah in the original, and the addition of the word herself lends toward this conclusion. Emphasized accordingly, it would read, even Sarah herself was affected by Abraham's faith. Number 2, the phrase to conceive seed actually comes from a phrase that applies to what a man does, namely seeds, not to what a woman does who conceives. Number 3, the term she in she judged isn't in the original. A pronoun had to be supplied in harmony with one's interpretation, meaning that the translators could have just as well employed the pronoun he. Number 4, the next verse continues to speak about Abraham, saying, therefore from one man, emphasizing Abraham's faith, not Sarah's. Besides, number 5, Sarah never actually showed much faith when it came to her having children. Perhaps it was because that not only was she past the age of being able to conceive, but she couldn't even bear a child when she was young. And lastly, number 6, consider the similarity of verse 23, in which the faith of someone besides Moses was spoken of, even though it says, by faith, Moses. Nonetheless, however verse 11 is interpreted, the main point is still the same. Paul's readers needed to be like Abraham and or Sarah by judging him faithful who promised. In regards to Sarah, they just needed to surrender to God's timing. The same thing that the recipients of 2 Peter 3 verses 4 and 9 needed to do, by the way, if you want to check that out. Verse 12, therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. According to the literal language, there's indeed very little uncertainty that the phrase him as good as dead refers to Abraham's reproductive abilities as being unresponsive. Check out Romans 4:19. For an explanation of Abraham's apparent children later by Keturah, consult notes and commentaries by James Burton Kaufman and James McKnight. So, by means of an impotent man, God miraculously brought forth an innumerable people, the nation of Israel. And I do believe in this context that Paul had reference to the literal people of national Israel, not spiritual Israel. Thus, since Isaac was supernatural, then the Israelite nation was supernatural, and thus, in that sense, a special people who also brought forth a supernatural person, Jesus. Coincidentally, just as miracle baby Isaac brought physical Israel into God's favor, so miracle baby Jesus distanced them from God's favor, superseding them with the melting pot nation of spiritual Israel. So the strength of faith in this case was that there was simple confidence in God's fulfillment of a promise when all human probabilities were against it. Verses 13 and 14. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. The phrase, these all died in faith, means that not only did these men live in faith, but they also died in it. The phrase, the promises, actually refers to the things promised. And what were those things? Number 1, there would be numerous descendants for Abraham, Genesis 13, Genesis 15, Genesis 17, Genesis 22. Number 2, God would be God to him and his descendants, Genesis 17. Number 3, an everlasting inheritance would be theirs, Genesis 12, Genesis 13, Genesis 15, Genesis 17. And number 4, all nations would be blessed through them, Genesis 12 and Genesis 22. And I give all the verses in the book itself if you want to go look them up. If you have the book, that is. If you don't, please go buy one. You can get it through me directly at tedenton64@hotmail.com. Okay, moving on. Furthermore, it must be remembered that there were two sides to these promises, a physical fulfillment and a spiritual fulfillment, a physical family and a spiritual family, a type and an antitype. The clause, having seen the things promised afar off, obviously includes both the physical and the spiritual promises fulfilled. And Jesus referred to one of the spiritual ones that they saw when he said, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. John 8:56. The word embraced is from a word which can be and has been translated as saluted, as well as embraced. Thus it must be interpreted according to its context. Here the word saluted or greeted would probably be the best rendering due to the clause, having seen them afar off, or at a distance, because the word embraced calls for closeness, not distance. So in other words, they saluted what they saw in the future that was coming. Like the clause, having seen them afar off, the clause confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth literally reads, having confessed that they were. Thus, the sentence might be better understood today if the last clause were placed first. And if so, here's how it would read with some comments included. Having confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth, these men, having not received the promises, died in expectation of them. But, having seen them at a distance, by the eye of faith, they saluted them. One might look at this as sailors on a ship searching for an island that they were convinced existed, but because they were torpedoed, could only salute it as they got within eyeshot. There's very little difference between strangers and pilgrims here in verse 13. Strangers are foreigners, while pilgrims are those who don't have citizenship where they live. Abraham said to the Hittites, I am a foreigner and a visitor among you, Genesis 23:4. Why? Because he was looking for the city, whose architect and builder is God, verse 10. Abraham, even as the first generation Christians, realized his citizenship was in heaven, not on earth, Philippians 3, verse 20. The phrase a homeland here refers to a spiritual place in which they would have citizenship and therefore rights as citizens. The Greek term for a homeland is patris and may be rendered as the fatherland, or perhaps even as the father's country. As with verse 11, this passage teaches that true trust doesn't require God to meet our timetables. By the way, I always found it interesting that while Russia refers to their world and their land as the motherland, Germany refers to her world and her land as the fatherland. And that's the idea here. A homeland is from the Greek word for fatherland. Anyway, as with verse 11, this passage teaches that true trust doesn't require God to meet our timetables. All right, verse 15. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. Besides the fact that their faith was strong enough so as to give them the determination to live as nomads in waiting for a homeland that they'd never see, it also gave them the determination to remain as nomads for life in a land not their own when they could have easily returned home. It's as if their faith had them so excited about the promises of God that they didn't even consider turning back and losing favor with Him. Abraham, in fact, charged his steward Eliezer to swear that he'd never allow Isaac to go back to Abraham's native land, Genesis 24, 1-9. Surely we can see how this corresponds to Paul's audience. Although at first glance this verse may seem to be somewhat unimportant in the scheme of the chapter, it's perhaps the most significant verse so far. The point is, they, whether Abraham's clan or these Hebrews, weren't being forced to follow God's desires for them. If they desired to turn back and were willing to bear the consequences, they were certainly free to do so. But that's just it. There'd be severe consequences in rejecting God's will and gift. Again, another shot at Calvinism. Verse 16. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared a city for them. It's held by some that the term now is logical, not temporal, meaning some believe, and I agree, that Paul employed it in the form of argumentation, not to necessarily suggest a point in time. They were desiring a better country, a place better than Chaldea and even better than Canaan, better because it would be of a heavenly nature or from heaven. Check out 2 Timothy 4, Hebrews 12, Revelation 21, and perhaps even 1 Corinthians 15, where the body and or the man may be viewed as equivalent to the kingdom. I have the verses listed in the book itself. The clause, God is not ashamed to be called their God, refers to the idea that God doesn't object to being called things like the God of Abraham, or the God of Isaac, or the God of Jacob, or the God of whomever, provided they have the kind of obedient faith that Paul had been discussing. By the way, the lack of shame in God's eyes for His people is reminiscent of the lack of shame in Jesus' eyes for them in chapter 2, verse 11. The clause, He has prepared a city for them, is prophetic in tone. Prophecy is very often spoken as having been accomplished when, in earthly time, it actually hasn't been. Check out Romans 4:17. For examples, in a prophecy about Jesus, God said, out of Egypt I called, past tense, my son, Hosea 11 verse 1. And Jesus, a while before He was even sacrificed, said to His disciples, I have overcome, past tense, the world, John 16:33. Authors of hermeneutic works refer to this as now but not yet language, or proleptic language. In other words, it's so certain to occur that it's spoken of as having already occurred. All right, verses 17 through 18. By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called. Genesis 22:1 and following. So far, Paul has written about Abraham's faith when he didn't know where he was going, verses 8 through 10, or how God's will would be accomplished, verses 11 and 12, or when God would fulfill His promises, 13 through 16. Now here, in verses 17 through 19, Paul wrote about Abraham's faith when he didn't know why God was doing what He was doing. The phrase, when he was tested, actually refers to the idea of when his faith was put to the test. God had worked on Abraham's faith for many years, putting him through various trials. For example, calling him to leave his native land and relatives to become a wanderer in a foreign land, making him wait 25 years for his promised son, and having him kick Ishmael out of his home. So this case seems to be what proved once and for all that Abraham had finally reached a plateau, an area of stability in his faith. Check out Romans 4:19-20, where it says, "Being not weak in faith, he did not waver," because this was toward the end of all of his testing when his faith had been stabilized. The phrase "offered up Isaac" here is in the perfect tense, indicating intention, meaning that in Abraham's mind, Isaac had already been sacrificed. There was simply no doubt in his mind that he would obey God's wishes. Along that 2 or 3 day trek to the mountain, it was to him as if it were already, though not yet, all done and over with. Notice just how strong Abraham's faith had become by this time. Verse 19 tells us Abraham was accounting that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. Not only did Abraham believe God was able to raise Isaac up from the dead, but a statement he made to his servants appears to even indicate he expected such. Genesis 22:5 has Abraham saying, "Stay here. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you." See, it says, "We will come back." Remember the Shunammite woman's story in 2 Kings chapter 4? She couldn't have children, so God, through Elisha, miraculously provided her one. When a child died, she thus believed God could also miraculously raise her son from the dead, which of course he did. Likewise, Abraham was given a son miraculously, and by this time in his life he had come to believe that not only could God miraculously raise him from the dead in order to fulfill his promises, but even that he would raise him from the dead to fulfill those promises. And because God recognized this confident kind of faith in Abraham, he just saved himself the trouble, as well as Abraham and Isaac the pain, by stopping Abraham from killing Isaac in the first place. The term for figurative here in verse 19, as it is in chapter 9, verse 9, is actually the Greek word normally translated parable. That is, a story or an event that, like a shadow, mirrors something similar to it. So what was being reflected by this incident with Isaac? His rising from the dead, for nothing normally rose from a sacrificial altar. Here's a side note for you, a couple of them. Number one, although I believe that this incident typifies Jesus' death and resurrection, I don't believe that sentence structure or context demands that such was what Paul had in mind when he used the word figurative here. If, however, Paul did have Jesus' death and resurrection in mind, perhaps it was at this point that Abraham saw Jesus' day and was glad, John 8:36. I can only wish I knew when this occurred. Side note number two, perhaps Paul was also indirectly indicating to these Hebrews that, yes, God may very well expect you to suffer death for his cause, Revelation 6:9-11, but then again, he might save you just when things look the most bleak. That was, after all, during the time of miracle working, when God was still involved in miracles. In conclusion to this section, keep in mind that Paul's obvious and primary point through all of this was that his readers, like their forefathers, needed to keep the faith concerning God's promises because they would be fulfilled in God's time. And in their case, it was actually going to be in just a very, very little while, chapter 10, verse 37, and compare that with 2 Peter 3:3-4, and 2 Peter 3, verses 8 and 9. Okay, now at this point, I'm going to go to page 320 in my book, and I'm going to read to you my translation of this particular section that we just studied in my book. So, Hebrews 11, verses 8-19 in my translation on page 320. By faith Abraham, being called to go out to a place which he was about to receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he headed out without knowing where he was going. By faith he lived as an immigrant in the land of promise, as in a foreign city, dwelling in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, the joint heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with permanent foundations, of which God is the architect and builder. By faith he, even in his old age and with Sarah being barren, was enabled to become a father, because he deemed him faithful who had promised. In fact, of this one man, and one past age at that, there were born children as numerous as the stars of heaven and as countless as the grains of sand by the sea. Although not receiving the fulfillment of the promises themselves, all these men died in faith because they saw and saluted the promised blessings from afar, confessing that they were foreigners and nomads upon the land. Those who confess such things demonstrate that they're earnestly seeking the Father's land. In fact, had they kept thinking about the land from which they had come, they probably would have taken an opportunity to return to it. But instead, they're yearning for a better, heavenly home. Therefore, God has prepared a city for them and is not ashamed to be called upon as their God. By faith, Abraham, the one who joyfully received the promises, when he was tested, obeyed by offering up his only begotten son Isaac, even though it was said to him, "What will be called your seed will be by means of Isaac." But he believed that God is even able to raise up men from among dead ones, from which in a figure Abraham indeed received Isaac back. All right, that was installment 28 of my audiobook of Hebrews from Flawed to Flawless Fulfilled, specifically Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 19. So I look forward to sharing the next section with you next week. Thank you for being with me, and have a great week.